The morning sun glinted off polished steel as William Iron Bill Harrington stood before the massive M1 Abrams tank displayed in the center of the Fort Benning Armor Museum. At 61, his back remained ramrod straight, a permanent gift from decades in uniform. His weathered hands, marked by countless hours gripping controls and tools, rested on the shoulders of his 12-year-old grandson, Tommy. The boy's eyes reflected the same wonder Bill had felt nearly 40 years earlier, when he'd first seen the machine that would define his life. "Can I touch it, Grandpa?" Tommy whispered, as though they stood in a church rather than a museum. Bill nodded, watching as the boy stepped forward to place his small hand against the cool metal of the tank's hull. A familiar ache bloomed in Bill's chest. The Abrams had been his home, his protector, his weapon. More than that, it had been the vessel that carried him and his men through hell and back. "You drove one of these, right, Grandpa?" Tommy asked, his palm still pressed against the steel. Bill let a slow smile form. "Not just drove it, son." His voice dropped an octave, laden with memories. "I lived with it." Tommy turned, his eyes wide with curiosity. "What's that mean?" Bill guided his grandson to a bench facing the tank. The museum was nearly empty on this Wednesday morning, offering them a rare moment of privacy amid the silent sentinels of American armor history. From where they sat, the Abrams dominated their view, its gun barrel pointing towards some distant, unseen enemy. "You see, Tommy, a tank isn't just a machine, it's a home. For days, sometimes weeks, 4 men live in that steel box. We ate there, slept there when we could. We fought together, bled together." He paused, swallowing hard. "Some died together." Bill's mind drifted back to Pittsburgh, 1979. His father's calloused hands, black with coal dust and steel mill grime, pushing a small model tank across their kitchen table. 3 generations of Harrington men had served, his grandfather in the Great War, his father commanding a Sherman in World War II. Now it was his turn. The pressure of legacy had weighed on him since childhood. "My dad worked 40 years at the steel mill," Bill told Tommy. "Said the metal in our veins matched the metal in the tanks. Called it American steel, American heart." He chuckled softly. "Sounds corny now, but back then, it meant something." The Harringtons had been working men for generations, their hands shaping the very materials that built the nation. When Bill enlisted, his father had nodded once, a gesture containing generations of pride. No words needed. In the Harrington family, service wasn't discussed. It was assumed. Fort Knox, 1980. Basic training had hardened him, but armor school had transformed him. The first time he climbed inside a tank, an older M60 model then, it felt like coming home. The enclosed space that made others claustrophobic gave him comfort. The mechanical precision, the choreographed movements of the crew, the raw power at his fingertips, all of it spoke to something primal in his soul. "I moved up fast," Bill continued, watching Tommy's rapt face. "Made sergeant in 2 years. By the time the Abrams entered service in 81, I was training to be a tank commander." The boy pointed to the 4-pointed star insignia painted on the museum tank's turret. "Is that your unit?" "Close. That's the 3rd Infantry Division. I served with the 3rd Armored. We called ourselves Spearhead. When the Abrams first rolled out, I was selected for the initial training cadre. Got to know that machine inside and out." Tommy nodded, trying to process this information. "Is that when you became an officer?" Bill's lips pressed together briefly. "No, son, that came later." He stared at the massive tank, remembering the weight of decisions, the burden of command. "They offered me a battlefield commission after our first combat deployment. Wanted to make me a lieutenant, then move me to battalion staff." "That sounds important," Tommy said. It was. Most men would have jumped at the chance. Bill's fingers tapped a rhythm on his knee, but I turned it down. Tommy's brow furrowed. "Why would you do that?" Bill smiled, a distant look in his eyes. "A tank is a family, Tommy. 4 men living and fighting as one. My crew, Frank, James, and Michael, they were the best damn tankers in the Army. We developed something special, something that can't be taught in any training manual." He looked down at his grandson, placing a hand on his shoulder. "When you find your place, truly find where you belong, you don't abandon it for rank or prestige. I couldn't leave my men. A tank commander leads from inside the tank, not from behind a desk. So I stayed a senior non-commissioned officer until they forced me to accept a commission years later." The weight of that decision still lingered with him. His father hadn't understood. The Harringtons were always ambitious, always climbing. But Bill had recognized something more valuable than promotion. His crew had become extensions of himself, a brotherhood forged in training and tempered in combat. "You were the best, weren't you, Grandpa?" Tommy asked, a note of pride in his voice. Bill looked at his grandson, seeing in those young eyes the same hunger for achievement that had driven him decades ago. "We were good, Tommy, very good." He paused, memories washing over him. "Our crew had the highest qualification scores in the battalion 3 years running. We could hit targets most crews couldn't even spot." What he didn't say, what he couldn't fully explain to a 12-year-old, was how that excellence had been built on countless hours of practice, on frozen nights and blistering days, on arguments and reconciliations, on near misses and brilliant successes. "There's something you should know, Tommy." Bill's voice grew quiet. "Something I've never told anyone in the family." The boy leaned closer. "The Army wanted to split us up, take the best men and make them train others. It made sense on paper, spread the expertise around. But I fought it, wrote letters all the way up to the colonel, arguing that we were more valuable as an intact unit." Tommy's eyes widened. "Did it work?" "Not at first," Bill shook his head. "But then I did something that wasn't exactly by the book." He remembered that night, hunched over a field desk in Germany, the lamp casting harsh shadows as he filled page after page with everything he knew. Tank tactics that weren't in any field manual. Techniques his crew had developed through trial and error. Maintenance shortcuts that kept the Abrams running when others failed. "I wrote it all down, Tommy. Everything I'd learned about tanks, about leadership, about combat. Filled a whole notebook with diagrams, procedures, tactics. Things they didn't teach at armor school, but that every tanker needed to know." He'd handed the notebook to his colonel with a simple proposition: keep his crew together, and the Army could have his knowledge. The colonel had been angry at first, then intrigued, and finally impressed. "What happened next?" Tommy pressed. "The colonel made copies, sent them up the chain of command. Next thing I knew, instructors from Fort Knox were calling me, asking questions." Bill's voice dropped to a near whisper. 6 months later, I saw pages from my notebook in the new armor training manual. They kept my crew together after that." Tommy's eyes grew wide. "That's amazing, Grandpa." "It wasn't about recognition, son." Bill stared at the Abrams, its massive form dominating the museum floor. "It was about keeping my men together, about making sure other crews had the knowledge to survive." What Bill didn't tell his grandson was how that notebook had changed the trajectory of his career, how it had marked him as someone who understood armored warfare at an instinctive level, how it had eventually led to his reluctant promotion into roles he'd never anticipated. 2 years later, when we deployed to Desert Storm, we were the most effective tank crew in the battalion, Bill continued. Not because we were smarter or stronger, but because we were a family. We knew each other's movements, could anticipate each other's decisions. In combat, that makes all the difference. A group of tourists entered the museum, their chatter breaking the reverent silence. Bill checked his watch. They had an appointment with the museum director at 11, a private viewing of materials not on public display. His old battle maps, combat logs, and personal photographs had been donated to the museum's archive last year. "Come on, Tommy," Bill said, standing. "There's more I want to show you, something few people ever get to see." As they walked toward the administration offices, Tommy looked up at his grandfather. "Do you miss it, Grandpa, being a tank commander?" Bill paused, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Every day, son, every single day." The truth was both simpler and more complex than he could express. He missed the purpose, the clarity, the brotherhood. He missed the machine itself, 54 tons of American engineering excellence, responding to his commands like an extension of his own body. Most of all, he missed the men. Frank was gone now, taken by cancer 3 years ago. James and Michael were still around, though scattered across the country. They spoke monthly, bound by memories few others could comprehend. What he'd found in that tank, what he'd built with those men, had defined his life in ways nothing else could match. And now, walking beside his grandson, he felt the weight of those memories, the responsibility to preserve them, to pass on not just the facts, but the feeling of what it meant to be a tank commander in the United States Army. "Some things you can't explain, Tommy," he finally said. "Some things you have to experience, but I'm going to try my best to help you understand." Together, they walked deeper into the museum, the morning sun casting long shadows behind them. the past and future intertwined in their matched stride. Chapter 2, Komaitep Vanguilai. The museum's private archives smelled of paper and time. William Harrington sat beside his grandson at a large table where the archivist had laid out technical manuals, photographs, and diagrams. A paper testament to American armored might. This, Bill said, carefully unfolding a large schematic, is what makes the Abrams special. His weathered finger traced the cutaway drawing of the M1's turret, lingering over the fire control system. Tommy leaned in, eyes wide with fascination. Most people think it's all about the gun or the armor, Bill continued, his voice taking on the measured cadence of an instructor. But the heart of the Abrams is right here, the ballistic computer and stabilization system. He explained how the computer calculated a dozen variables in milliseconds: target range, wind speed, barrel wear, ammunition type, even the Earth's rotation for extreme distance shots. How the gun could remain locked on target while the tank moved over rough terrain at 30 miles per hour. We could hit a target the size of a trash can from over a mile away, while both we and the target were moving, Bill said, pride evident in his voice. No other tank in the world could match that precision when the Abrams first entered service. Tommy's finger hovered over the diagram. What's this part, Grandpa? That's the gunner's primary sight, what we call the GPS. Bill smiled at the memory. Frank, our gunner, used to say it was better than eagle eyes. Thermal imaging meant we could see enemy tanks through dust, smoke, even light foliage. Day or night didn't matter. He didn't mention how that advantage had played out in the featureless deserts of Iraq, how they'd spotted and engaged Republican Guard T-72s long before the enemy knew they were there. Some memories weren't meant for 12-year-old ears. And this? Tommy pointed to another section. Ah, Bill nodded appreciatively. That's the heart of the beast. The AGT 1500 gas turbine engine, 1500 horsepower, could push 54 tons from 0 to 20 miles per hour in 7 seconds. What the diagram couldn't convey was the feeling, the raw power surging through the tank as it accelerated. The deep turbine whine that became the soundtrack to their lives. The way the massive machine seemed to leap forward like something alive. The Soviet tanks, the T-72s we faced, used diesel engines. Simpler, easier to maintain, Bill acknowledged. But our turbine gave us a critical advantage in maneuverability. We could outflank them, get to firing positions faster, retreat if necessary. He turned to another page in the manual, this one showing the interior layout. This is where we lived, Tommy, tighter than your bedroom closet, shared between 4 grown men. The commander's station was positioned in the turret, behind and above the gunner. From there, Bill had directed the tank's movements, identified targets, coordinated with other vehicles, all while maintaining awareness of the battlefield around them. As commander, I could see everything through my vision blocks and periscopes, had override controls for the gun if needed, though Frank rarely needed correction. He tapped another position. The gunner sat here, lower in the turret. His whole world was that primary sight, looking for targets, keeping them in the crosshairs. Bill's finger moved to the loader's station. Michael stood here. His job was to take the rounds, some weighing over 40 pounds, from the storage racks and load them into the breech. Had to do it fast, had to do it right every time. Finally, he indicated the driver's compartment in the hull. And James was down here, separated from the rest of us. He could only see forward through his vision blocks, relied on our directions through the intercom to know where to go when the hatches were closed. Tommy studied the diagram intently. It looks really cramped. It was. Bill nodded, remembering the constant press of metal, equipment, and bodies. In summer, even with environmental controls, temperatures could hit 100 degrees inside. In winter, we'd go from freezing to sweltering as the systems warmed up. What he didn't describe was the smell, the unique combination of hydraulic fluid, gun oil, sweat, and fear that permeated every tank. Or how, after weeks in the field, the crew developed a shared funk that no amount of baby wipes could fully address. Or the way they'd learned to move in synchronized patterns, avoiding collisions in the confined space through an unspoken choreography. But here's the thing, Tommy. Bill leaned closer to his grandson. That cramped space created something special. When you're that close to 3 other men, when your lives depend on each other, you develop a connection that's hard to explain to outsiders. He pulled out a faded photograph from a folder. 4 young men standing before their tank. Their arms were draped over each other's shoulders, faces smudged with dust, but grinning with the confidence of youth and mastery. "That's us, Thunder Road's crew." He pointed to each figure in turn. "That's me, of course. The tall fellow next to me is Frank Murphy, Doc, best gunner in the battalion, former medical student before he joined up, hence the nickname." Frank's lanky frame and serious eyes belied the steady hands that had made him a natural on the gun controls. The man had been able to spot and identify vehicles at ranges that seemed impossible. Next to him is James Scott, Lightning, our driver. Used to race stock cars before the Army. Had a feel for the Abrams like it was an extension of his own body. James was the shortest of the group, compact and muscular, with a perpetual half-smile that masked a calculating mind. He could thread the massive tank through spaces that seemed too narrow, could feel the exact moment when tracks might lose traction. And that's Michael Anderson, Books, our loader engineering student who enlisted because he wanted hands-on experience before finishing his degree. Michael was watching the others laugh in the photo, his own expression thoughtful. The youngest of the crew, he'd brought an analytical mind and unexpected physical strength to the loader's position. Together we were Thunder Road. Bill's voice softened with the name. Named after my father's favorite song. Said it reminded him of how a good tank crew should operate. Fast, precise, unstoppable. Tommy studied the faces in the photograph. They looked so young. We were. I was 26 when this was taken. Frank was 30. James was 24. Michael just 21. Bill shook his head at the memory. Boys, really. But the Army has a way of aging you quickly. He didn't mention how much older they'd all been by the end of Desert Storm. How experience had etched itself into their features in ways no photograph could capture. "How did you pick them?" Tommy asked. "Were they assigned to you?" Bill shook his head. "That's not how it works with the best crews. A tank commander builds his team carefully, like a coach drafting players." He smiled at the memory. "When I made tank commander, I had my pick of available personnel. Spent weeks observing training, reviewing records, even watching how men carried themselves in the mess hall. The selection process had been instinctive rather than scientific. He'd looked for technical skill, yes, but also adaptability, emotional stability, and that indefinable quality that separated good soldiers from great ones. Frank was easy. His gunnery scores were off the charts. But more than that, he had patience. Could sit motionless for hours waiting for the perfect shot. Bill tapped the photo. James was actually on report for insubordination when I found him. His previous commander couldn't handle his independent thinking. I saw it as initiative. Tommy grinned at that. And Michael? Books was the wild card. Not the strongest loader candidate physically, but he had something special. A methodical mind, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Bill's eyes crinkled with the memory. First time I saw him load, his movements were so efficient, it was like watching a machine. No wasted motion. What Bill didn't tell his grandson was how he'd fought to get Michael transferred to his crew. How the battalion commander had questioned putting the scholarly, quiet soldier in a combat position. The decision had been vindicated in their first live-fire exercise, when Michael had set a company record for loading speed. Once I had my crew, the real work began. Bill flipped through more photos, the men working on track maintenance, practicing evacuation drills, sleeping in the field beside their tank. We trained constantly, 16-hour days sometimes. I pushed them harder than regulation required, and they never complained. Well, they had complained, colorfully and creatively, but they'd done the work. That was what mattered. We drilled until every movement became muscle memory, until each man could perform his duties blindfolded, until we could communicate with just a word or gesture. Bill's voice took on an intensity that made Tommy sit up straighter. Because when combat comes, you don't rise to the occasion. You fall to your level of training. He pulled out another document, a training log with columns of figures and terse comments in his own handwriting. We set records, Tommy. Fastest loading time, highest hit percentage, quickest emergency repairs. Pride colored his voice. Not because we were naturally better, but because we worked harder. Because we understood that excellence isn't an accident. The archivist approached with more materials, including a sealed box Bill had requested in advance. He nodded his thanks as she placed it before him. There's something else I want to show you. Bill carefully opened the box and removed a worn leather-bound notebook, its pages dog-eared and stained with use. This is the original. The notebook he'd mentioned earlier, his compilation of hard-won knowledge that had eventually influenced Army doctrine. He opened it carefully, revealing pages dense with handwritten notes, diagrams sketched with precision, calculations and observations gathered over years of experience. I started this my second year with the Abrams, Bill explained. Noticed things the manuals didn't cover, figured out better ways to perform certain tasks, developed tactics based on the tank's actual capabilities, not just what the designers intended. Tommy leaned forward, tracing a finger over a detailed drawing of firing positions utilizing hull-down techniques. You drew all this? Bill nodded. Engineering runs in the Harrington blood. My grandfather could sketch a bridge support from memory. My father could diagram an entire steel mill production line. He turned pages slowly, pointing out innovations his crew had developed, how they'd modified the loader's stance to reduce fatigue during extended operations, how they'd discovered that adjusting the turret rotation speed by 5% improved target acquisition in certain conditions, how they'd worked out a maintenance schedule that kept their tank operational when others were sidelined with mechanical issues. The Army eventually incorporated most of these into official doctrine, Bill said, unable to keep a note of pride from his voice. Not with my name attached, of course, but knowing these techniques helped save lives. That was enough. What he didn't tell Tommy was how that notebook had become almost mythical within certain circles of the armor branch. How copies had circulated unofficially before the official adoption. How even now, decades later, instructors at Fort Benning sometimes referred to Harrington's rules when teaching certain techniques. The Pentagon actually called me in as a consultant when they were developing the M1A2 upgrade package, Bill continued, wanted my input on the commander's independent thermal viewer and the improved fire control system. Tommy's eyes widened. Really? They asked for your help specifically? They did. Bill closed the notebook carefully. By then, our experiences in Desert Storm had validated many of my approaches. Hard to argue with success. He replaced the notebook in its box, handling it with the reverence usually reserved for religious texts. In many ways, that's what it had been for him, a Bible of armored warfare written in the language of steel and fire. A good tank crew is like a championship sports team, Tommy. Bill leaned back in his chair, eyes distant with memory. Each member has a specific role, but success comes from how they function together, how they anticipate each other's moves, how they compensate for each other's weaknesses. He drilled this philosophy into his men from day one. The gunner was the team's sniper, the driver its legs, the loader its strength, and the commander its brain and eyes. But a tank was more than the sum of these parts. It was a single organism, 54 tons of synchronized purpose. Frank could tell from the slightest change in my voice when I'd spotted something important, Bill said. James could feel terrain changes that would affect our stability and adjust before I gave the order. Michael could have ammunition ready for loading before Frank called for it. These weren't just skills. They were intuitions developed through thousands of hours working as one unit. The kind of intuitions that meant the difference between life and death when combat erupted. We weren't just operating a machine, Tommy. We became the machine. Bill's voice dropped lower. And when Desert Storm came, that machine was tested in fire. The archivist approached again, reminding them gently that their time was coming to an end. Bill nodded acknowledgement, then turned back to his grandson. There's one more thing I want to show you before we go. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. Carefully unfolding it, he revealed a tarnished brass compass. This belonged to my father. He carried it through Europe in World War II, commanding a Sherman tank. Bill placed it in Tommy's palm. He gave it to me before my first deployment. Said a tank commander needs to know not just where he is, but where he's going. The compass was a simple military model, its face scratched from decades of use. The needle still swung true, finding north with unerring accuracy. I want you to have it, Tommy. Bill closed his grandson's fingers around the compass. Not because I expect you to follow the family tradition, but because I want you to remember what it represents. Direction, purpose, the ability to find your way when the path isn't clear. Tommy looked up, his young face solemn with the weight of the gift. Thank you, Grandpa. I'll take good care of it. Bill nodded, throat suddenly tight. 3 generations of Harrington men had carried that compass into battle. It had guided them through European forests, Korean mountains, Middle Eastern deserts. Now it passed to a 4th generation, its future uncertain, but its legacy secure. Come on, he said, standing. We've got more to see. As they gathered their belongings, Bill took one last look at the materials spread across the table, the physical artifacts of his time in armor. The real legacy, he knew, wasn't in these papers and photographs. It was in the lives he'd influenced, the knowledge he'd passed on, and now in the understanding dawning in his grandson's eyes. Together, they walked from the archive room, the compass a solid weight in Tommy's pocket, pointing toward a future neither could yet see. Chapter 3, Tuluadotin. The afternoon sun slanted through the museum's high windows, casting long shadows across the exhibition floor. William Harrington and his grandson had worked their way through displays chronicling the evolution of American armor, from early World War I tanks to modern marvels of engineering. Now they stood before a special exhibit dedicated to Operation Desert Storm. Behind glass lay the artifacts of that conflict: maps, unit patches, Iraqi equipment captured during the 100-hour ground war. A large screen played footage of M1 Abrams tanks moving across the desert in formation, dust plumes rising behind them like maritime wakes. "There we are," Bill said quietly, pointing to a tank in the lead position. "Thunder Road, February 24th, 1991. Tommy leaned closer to the screen, eyes wide. "That's really you?" Bill nodded, memories washing over him in waves, the weight of responsibility, the knot of anticipation that had settled in his stomach, the taste of dust that permeated everything. "G'day," the start of the ground war. His voice took on a distant quality. We'd been in Saudi Arabia for months, training, preparing. Now we were finally moving north into Iraq. The footage showed tanks advancing in perfect formation across a featureless landscape. What it couldn't capture was the tension inside those steel hulls, the hyper-awareness, the controlled fear, the constant vigilance that had defined those hours. The division's mission was to penetrate Iraqi defenses and destroy the Republican Guard forces, Bill explained. Our battalion was the tip of the spear. He didn't mention that their position meant they would likely be the first to encounter enemy armor, the first to test American tanks against their Soviet-built counterparts in direct combat. "Were you scared?" Tommy asked, his voice hushed. Bill considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," he finally said, "not paralyzing fear. More like intense focus. Every sense heightened. We'd trained for years for this moment, but training isn't combat." What he recalled most vividly was the silence inside the tank, how his normally talkative crew had gone quiet as they crossed the border, each man locked in his own thoughts, performing his duties with mechanical precision. "The first day was mostly movement," Bill continued, "covering ground, bypassing obstacles. The Iraqis had prepared elaborate defenses, but our route took us around the heaviest concentrations." He pointed to a map displayed nearby, tracing the sweeping left hook that had defined the coalition strategy, avoiding the teeth of Iraqi defenses to strike from an unexpected direction. By the second day, we'd begun to encounter scattered resistance, mostly infantry, some artillery, nothing our air support couldn't handle. Bill's expression grew more serious. But on the third day, we made contact with the Republican Guard's Tawakalna division. That's when we faced our first T-72s. Tommy looked up at his grandfather, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "What happened?" Bill motioned for his grandson to sit on a nearby bench. This wasn't a story to be rushed or told standing. "We were advancing through a shallow valley when our forward scouts reported enemy armor ahead. Battalion ordered us to take the lead since we had the most experienced crew." Bill's eyes focused on something distant, seeing not the museum, but the Iraqi desert. "I remember how quiet it got on the radio. Everyone knew what was coming." He described positioning their tank on a slight rise, using the hold-down technique that kept most of the vehicle protected behind terrain while allowing the turret to engage targets. Frank spotted them first through the thermal sight. 4 T-72s about 3 kilometers out, moving perpendicular to our position. Bill's hands moved unconsciously, mimicking the motions of operating the commander's controls. They hadn't seen us yet. We had the element of surprise. The T-72 had been the Soviet Union's main battle tank, exported widely to allied nations like Iraq. While formidable, it had significant disadvantages against the Abrams, particularly in optics, fire control, and armor protection. "I called it in, got clearance to engage." Bill's voice tightened almost imperceptibly. "Then I gave Frank the order. Gunner Sabot, T-72, 3 o'clock. Sabot rounds, technically armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot, were designed specifically for defeating enemy armor. A depleted uranium penetrator, wrapped in a casing that fell away after leaving the barrel, delivering devastating kinetic energy to the target. Michael loaded in under 6 seconds. Frank acquired the lead tank almost instantly. Bill's words came faster now, caught in the momentum of memory. I remember watching through my sight as Frank centered the crosshairs just below the turret ring, the most vulnerable point. He made a subtle gesture with his hand, mimicking the minute adjustments a gunner would make. Frank said, "On the way," and fired. Even expecting it, the sound was like a physical blow inside the tank. The breech recoiled, ejecting the spent casing, and Michael was already moving to load the next round. Tommy leaned forward, completely absorbed in the story. We hit the T-72 square where Frank had aimed, saw the sabot punch through the armor like it was aluminum foil. Bill's voice remained clinical, detached. Secondary explosion as the ammunition inside cooked off. The turret actually separated from the hull, what we call a catastrophic kill. What he didn't describe was the brief, terrible glimpse of enemy crewmen trying to escape the burning vehicle. Some things weren't meant for 12-year-old ears. The other Iraqi tanks spotted our muzzle flash and began to maneuver, but they were too slow, their optics too limited. Bill shook his head slightly. We engaged the second tank before they could get a fix on our position. Another direct hit. The remaining 2 T-72s had attempted to retreat behind a low ridge, but the Abrams' superior fire control system had allowed Thunder Road to hit them while moving, something the Iraqi tanks couldn't effectively counter. 4 targets, 4 kills, in under 2 minutes, Bill concluded. Battalion Command couldn't believe it when I reported, wanted confirmation. He didn't mention this mixture of elation and horror that had filled the tank after that first engagement. The professional satisfaction of performing as trained, tempered by the sobering reality of what they'd just done. After that, our reputation spread quickly through the division. We were assigned to lead more engagements, to spearhead advances into areas where enemy armor was expected. Pride crept into Bill's voice despite his attempt at modesty. By the end of the ground war, Thunder Road had confirmed kills on 11 T-72s and 8 other armored vehicles. No other tank in the battalion came close. Tommy's eyes were wide. "You destroyed 11 enemy tanks?" Bill nodded slowly. "We did, but there's something important you should understand, Tommy. Something that doesn't make it into the history books or the movies." He leaned forward, making sure he had his grandson's full attention. "War isn't a game or a sport. There's no glory in destroying an enemy tank, because inside that tank are men not so different from ourselves. Sons, brothers, fathers, following orders, serving their country as they understood it." Bill had never forgotten that truth, even in the heat of combat, had never allowed his crew to celebrate kills or mark their gun barrel with tallies, as some units did. "The most important decision I ever made wasn't which target to engage first or what terrain to use for cover," he continued. "It was when to hold fire." Tommy's brow furrowed. "Hold fire? But I thought your job was to destroy enemy tanks." "Our job was to accomplish the mission while preserving life when possible, including enemy lives." Bill's expression was solemn. "There's a moment I've never talked about, not even with your grandmother, something that happened on the 4th day of the ground war." He hadn't planned to share this story, but sitting here, seeing the curiosity and admiration in his grandson's eyes, he felt the need to balance the scales, to show that true strength sometimes meant restraint. "We were advancing along a highway, part of the push toward Kuwait City, came upon 3 T-72s abandoned by their crews." Bill's voice softened. The Iraqis were surrendering by the hundreds by then, realizing they were outmatched. Their orders had been clear: destroy any enemy equipment that could be used against coalition forces, regardless of whether it was currently manned. I had Frank line up a shot on the nearest tank, standard procedure. Bill's gaze was distant again. But then I saw movement. Iraqi crewmen were returning to their vehicles, not to fight, but to retrieve personal belongings. Photos, letters, mementos. He'd faced a choice in that moment: follow orders to the letter or recognize the human element in the equation. I ordered Frank to hold fire. Bill looked directly at his grandson, radioed battalion that the tanks were already disabled, which wasn't strictly true. Then we waited, watching as those men took what mattered to them and walked away toward our lines of surrender. It had been a calculated risk. If those tankers had attempted to man their vehicles and fight, Thunder Road would have been held responsible. But Bill had read the situation correctly, had seen the defeat in their posture, the resignation in their movements. An hour later, airstrikes destroyed those tanks anyway, so the mission was accomplished. He shrugged slightly. But those men got to keep their dignity, their personal effects, and we didn't have to live with unnecessary killing on our conscience. Tommy processed this information slowly. Couldn't you have gotten in trouble? Absolutely. It was a judgment call that went against standing orders. Bill nodded. But part of leadership is knowing when rules need interpretation. We fight against machines, Tommy, not against men. When the men are no longer a threat, the machines are just steel and electronics. This philosophy had guided Bill throughout his career, earning him both respect and occasional friction with more aggressive commanders. He believed firmly that American power came with American responsibility, that might without restraint was just another form of tyranny. There's something else you should know about Desert Storm, Bill continued after a moment, something that affected Thunder Road directly. He explained how the ground war had revealed both the strengths and limitations of the early M1 Abrams. While superior to Iraqi tanks in almost every measure, the tanks had faced unexpected challenges in the desert environment. Sand got everywhere. Fine as talcum powder, it worked its way into air filters, engine components, electronics. Bill shook his head at the memory. Our maintenance crews were working round the clock just to keep the battalion operational. Thunder Road had faced its own mechanical crisis on the third night of the ground war. An air filter clogged beyond function, threatening to shut down the turbine engine in the middle of hostile territory. We had no replacement parts. Battalion maintenance was overwhelmed with similar issues across the company. Bill smiled faintly. That's when Michael, Books, showed why having an engineering student as your loader was invaluable. Using materials scavenged from an abandoned Iraqi truck and tools from their basic kit, Michael had fabricated a temporary filter system that allowed them to continue operations until proper replacements arrived. He rigged it up in the dark, working by flashlight, with enemy artillery landing less than a kilometer away. Pride colored Bill's voice again. Said it was just applied fluid dynamics. To the rest of us, it looked like magic. That improvised repair had kept Thunder Road in the fight during the critical push toward Kuwait City, had allowed them to maintain their position at the spearhead of the advance. The lesson, Tommy, is that technical knowledge saves lives in combat just as surely as marksmanship or tactics. Bill tapped his temple significantly. The mind is the most powerful weapon in any tank. This philosophy had informed his approach to training throughout his career, emphasizing not just procedural knowledge but deep understanding of the systems that made the Abrams function. His crews didn't just operate the tank, they comprehended it at a fundamental level. After Desert Storm, the Army began redesigning the air filtration system, based partly on our experiences, Bill said. The M1A2 incorporated changes that made it much more resistant to the fine desert sand. That's how progress happens, through hard lessons learned in the field. Tommy nodded, absorbing this information with the seriousness it deserved. Come on, Bill said, rising from the bench. There's one more exhibit I want to show you before we leave. They walked together to a display case near the exit. Inside, protected by glass and climate control, lay a tattered American flag beside a type citation and a Bronze Star medal. That's the flag we flew from Thunder Road's antenna during the entire ground campaign, Bill said quietly. And that's the medal awarded to Frank for his actions during our final engagement. The citation described how Frank Murphy had maintained his position at the gunner's controls, despite suffering a shrapnel wound when an enemy RPG had struck their tank's side skirt, how he had continued to engage targets with exceptional accuracy while bleeding from a head wound. What the citation doesn't mention is that Frank refused evacuation until the mission was complete, Bill added. Said he'd rather die in his gunner's seat than leave us short-handed. The wound had ultimately proven less severe than initially feared, the bleeding more dramatic than dangerous. But the courage it had revealed was entirely genuine. That's the quality you look for in a crew member, Tommy. Not just skill or intelligence, but character. The willingness to put the mission and the team above personal comfort or safety. Thunder Road had completed Desert Storm without losing a single crew member, a testament to skill, training, and no small amount of luck. Other tanks in their battalion hadn't been as fortunate. Bill had attended 3 funerals after returning to the States, honoring men he'd known and led. We were blessed, he said simply. Blessed with good training, good equipment, and good people. Not everyone can say the same. As they prepared to leave the museum, Tommy paused before the Desert Storm exhibit, looking thoughtfully at the footage still playing on the screen. Endless columns of American armor advancing across the desert toward an unseen enemy. Grandpa, he said hesitantly, do you think I could ever be a tank commander like you? Bill studied his grandson's face, seeing in it echoes of his own youthful determination. The question deserved more than a reflexive response. The army is different now, Tommy. The wars are different. The tanks themselves are different. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. But the fundamental qualities, leadership, technical aptitude, moral courage, those never change. He squeezed gently, feeling the slender frame that would someday fill out into a man's strength. If that's a path you choose to explore, I'll support you every step of the way. But remember what I showed you today. All of it. The technical excellence, yes, but also the human judgment. A tank is a weapon, but a tank commander is a guardian. Never forget the difference. Together, they walked from the museum into the fading afternoon light. The past, with its thunder of guns and clash of steel, receded behind them. But the lessons, the values, the hard-won wisdom remained, passed from one generation to the next, like the compass now riding in Tommy's pocket. The legacy of Thunder Road continued, not in metal and machinery, but in memory and meaning, in the understanding dawning in a young boy's eyes as he walked beside his grandfather, matching him step for step toward the future. The desert sun burned white-hot overhead as William Harrington and his grandson left the air-conditioned sanctuary of the museum. They crossed the parking lot to Bill's truck, the Georgia heat a pale imitation of what he'd experienced decades earlier in the Middle East. "That was incredible, Grandpa," Tommy said, clutching the compass in his pocket like a talisman. "But you never told me about all the problems with the tanks in the desert. Were they really that bad?" Bill waited until they were settled in the truck, the engine running and cool air beginning to flow before answering. Some stories required the right atmosphere. "The M1 Abrams was the finest tank in the world," he began, adjusting the air vents. "But no machine is perfect, especially in an environment it wasn't primarily designed for." He put the truck in gear and pulled away from the museum, heading toward the small diner where they'd agreed to meet Tommy's parents for dinner. There was time for one more story, one more lesson from a lifetime of armored warfare. The first challenge was the send. Bill's voice took on the measured cadence he'd used when briefing new crews. Not the coarse sand you'd find at the beach. This was powder fine, almost like talcum. It got everywhere, in our food, our clothes, our weapons. But for the tank, it was worse than an enemy shell. He described how the desert environment had tested the Abrams in ways that stateside training never could. The fine particles infiltrated every system, from electronics to engine components, abrading surfaces and clogging filters at an alarming rate. "We called it mechanical cancer," Bill said, signaling for a turn. "If you didn't catch it early, it would spread through the entire tank. Air filters would clog, engine efficiency would drop, turret rotation would slow. Eventually, the whole system would fail." The Army's maintenance protocols had proven inadequate for the extreme conditions. Designed for European environments, the procedures simply couldn't keep pace with the desert's punishing effects. "Battalion maintenance was overwhelmed within days," Bill continued. "They were working round the clock, but there weren't enough replacement parts, enough tools, enough time." Tommy leaned forward, intrigued by this less glamorous side of warfare. "So what did you do?" Bill smiled faintly. "We adapted. That's what soldiers do." Thunder Road's crew had developed their own maintenance regimen, more frequent than regulation required, more thorough than the manuals prescribed. They'd risen before dawn each day to clean filters, check seals, and inspect components that standard procedure didn't address. Frank and Michael took apart the primary site assembly and cleaned it daily, even though the manual said it only needed weekly maintenance. Bill shook his head at the memory. James would check track tension every 4 hours instead of once a day. And I inspected every fluid level, every hydraulic line, every electrical connection. The extra work had been exhausting, adding hours to already grueling days. But it had paid dividends. While other tanks in the battalion had been sidelined with mechanical failures, Thunder Road had remained operational throughout the conflict. "The worst moment came during a sandstorm," Bill said, his eyes fixed on the road but his mind clearly elsewhere. "Third day of the ground war. We were advancing toward the Republican Guard positions when it hit us. Visibility dropped to 0, had to button up completely. The sandstorm had struck, without warning, engulfing their entire column in a swirling maelstrom of dust and wind. Temperatures inside the sealed tank had soared past 100 degrees as the environmental control system struggled against the extreme conditions. We kept moving because we had to maintain the timeline," Bill continued. James was driving blind, following compass headings, and the occasional glimpse of the tank ahead when the storm briefly thinned. 4 hours into the storm, disaster had struck. The main air filters had clogged completely, choking off the engine's intake. Warning lights had flashed across the dashboard as the turbine began to lose power. We were 30 kilometers inside enemy territory, separated from our support elements, with a failing engine. Bill's knuckles whitened slightly on the steering wheel. If we went dead in the water, we'd be sitting ducks when the storm cleared. Tommy's eyes widened. What did you do? We stopped and did the impossible. Bill's voice carried a hint of pride beneath the matter-of-fact tone. Performed major maintenance in the middle of a sandstorm in hostile territory with limited tools and no replacement parts. The standard procedure would have been to call for recovery vehicles to wait for help. But recovery vehicles couldn't navigate in the storm, and waiting meant certain mission failure, possibly worse. I made the call to attempt field repairs, Bill said. It was against protocol. If we damaged the engine further, I would have faced serious consequences, but sometimes leadership means taking calculated risks. The crew had dismounted into the howling storm, visibility reduced to arm's length, sand stinging exposed skin like thousands of tiny needles. Working by touch as much as sight, they'd removed the clogged primary filters. Michael was our salvation that day, Bill continued, a note of admiration in his voice. He took one look at the filters and knew we couldn't clean them adequately, so he improvised. Using a damaged Iraqi radio they'd salvaged earlier, Michael had extracted filter material and fashioned a temporary replacement. It wasn't perfect, wouldn't last long, but it would allow them to continue the mission until proper repairs could be made. He performed what should have been a 6-hour maintenance operation in 90 minutes, in conditions that shouldn't have allowed any work at all. Bill shook his head in amazement even now, decades later. When we fired up the engine and it actually ran, I could have kissed him. They'd resumed the advance, maintaining position in the battalion column despite the setback. The improvised filter had held for 6 hours, just long enough to rendezvous with the maintenance unit when the storm finally abated. The battalion commander couldn't believe we were still operational, Bill said. When I showed him what Michael had done, he just shook his head and said, "That's why Thunder Road leads the column." What Bill didn't mention was how that experience had changed the Army's approach to desert operations. His after-action report, detailing their maintenance innovations and field repairs, had eventually influenced revisions to the technical manuals. There was another time, Bill continued, warming to the subject, when we went 72 hours without sleep during the final push to Kuwait City. The advance had been relentless, a continuous movement designed to prevent Iraqi forces from establishing defensive positions. Thunder Road had led the battalion column, setting the pace, identifying routes, engaging targets of opportunity. We rotated duties as much as possible, Bill explained. When we weren't in contact with the enemy, James would set the tank on a straight course across open desert, and Frank would take the commander's position while I caught 20 minutes of sleep. Then we'd rotate. They'd sustain themselves on adrenaline, caffeine pills, and sheer determination. Food had been limited to MREs, meals ready to eat, consumed cold while performing duties. Water had been rationed as the supply vehicles struggled to keep pace with the rapid advance. By the third day, we were operating on instinct, Bill admitted. Basic functions became challenging. Simple decisions required enormous concentration. The physical toll had been matched by the psychological strain, the constant vigilance, the life-or-death decisions, the knowledge that any lapse could cost lives. Yet they'd persevered, maintaining combat effectiveness when other crews had begun to falter. We reached Kuwait City with our objective complete and our tanks still operational, Bill said with quiet pride. Battalion reported that Thunder Road had traveled further, engaged more targets, and required less maintenance than any other tank in the company. Tommy absorbed this information with thoughtful silence. Bill glanced at his grandson, seeing the wheels turning behind those young eyes. There's a lesson there, Bill said after a moment. The greatest challenges in life are rarely what you expect them to be. We trained for combat against Soviet tanks, but our toughest opponent turned out to be fine Iraqi sand. He slowed the truck as they approached a traffic light, using the moment to gather his thoughts. Success often depends not on how you handle the threats you anticipated, but on how you adapt to the ones you didn't see coming. Bill looked directly at his grandson as the truck came to a stop. Remember that, Tommy? Flexibility and innovation are as important as strength and courage. The light changed and they continued toward the diner. Bill checked the time, still 30 minutes before they were due to meet Tommy's parents. Enough time for one more story from the desert. There's something else you should know, Bill said, his tone growing more serious. Something that happened after the main combat operations, during the occupation phase. He described how Thunder Road had been assigned to security operations in Kuwait City after liberation, protecting key infrastructure, maintaining order, supporting civilian authorities as they reclaimed their country. We were parked near a government building when a local man approached the tank. Bill's expression softened at the memory. Elderly fellow, maybe 70, carrying a tray with small glasses of tea. The crew had been suspicious at first. Force protection protocols discouraged accepting anything from locals. But the old Kuwaiti had been persistent, setting the tray on the ground and backing away with a deep bow. He spoke some English, Bill continued, said he'd been hiding in his home for months during the occupation, said American tanks meant his grandchildren could play outside again. They'd accepted the tea cautiously, testing it before consuming it. The gesture had touched them deeply, a simple act of gratitude amid the destruction and chaos of war's aftermath. We took a photograph with him, Bill said, smiling faintly. Frank gave him a unit patch as a souvenir. The old man wore it pinned to his robe like a medal. Such moments had been rare but significant, reminders of why they'd fought, what their sacrifices had accomplished. The human connection amid the machinery of war. I still have that photo somewhere, Bill mused. Should dig it out to show you. Puts everything else in perspective. They pulled into the diner's parking lot, 15 minutes early for their dinner reservation. Bill shut off the engine but made no move to exit the vehicle. There's something else I should tell you, Tommy. His voice took on a new gravity. Something about the aftermath of Desert Storm that doesn't make it into the history books or the museum displays. Tommy turned in his seat, sensing the shift in his grandfather's demeanor. After we returned stateside, some of the men in the battalion began experiencing health issues, Bill said carefully. Unexplained symptoms, fatigue, joint pain, cognitive problems, what they eventually called Gulf War syndrome. He explained how the military had initially been skeptical, how investigations had pursued various theories. Chemical weapons exposure, depleted uranium radiation, experimental vaccines, environmental toxins. Frank was one of the first to show symptoms, Bill continued, pain evident in his voice. Started with headaches, then memory problems. Doctors couldn't figure it out. Some suggested it was psychological, stress reaction, PTSD. Thunder Road's gunner had struggled for years, cycling through treatments, specialists, VA hospitals. His once steady hands had developed tremors. His eagle-eye vision had deteriorated. The man who could spot and identify a T-72 at 3 kilometers had eventually needed help reading a newspaper. We took care of him, Bill said firmly. James, Michael, and I made sure he got to appointments, helped with paperwork, stayed with him on the bad days. Because that's what a crew does. We take care of our own. What he didn't mention was how he'd fought the system, had written letters, made phone calls, attended meetings, demanding recognition and treatment for Frank and others like him. How he'd testified before a congressional committee, bringing his combat decorations and service record to bear on the issue. Eventually, the government acknowledged the syndrome was real, Bill said, established presumptive disability for certain conditions. Too late for some, but it helped Frank get the care he needed. Tommy processed this information with a maturity beyond his years. Is that why you became an advocate for veterans? Bill nodded, impressed by his grandson's perception. Partly. I realized that the fight doesn't end when you leave the battlefield. Sometimes the hardest battles come after you return home. His advocacy work had begun with Gulf War veterans, but had expanded to include all eras, all conflicts. He'd become known in veteran circles as a man who could navigate the bureaucracy, who understood both the military and civilian systems, who wouldn't take no for an answer. The most important mission I ever led wasn't in combat, Bill said quietly. It was making sure my men were taken care of after the shooting stopped. That's the real test of leadership. He checked his watch. 5 minutes until they were due to meet Tommy's parents. Time for one final thought before they went inside. I want you to understand something, Tommy. The glamour of war, the tanks, the weapons, the victories, that's what museums display. But the cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield and long after the conflict ends. Bill held his grandson's gaze. If you ever choose to serve, remember that. The mission includes taking care of your people, during and after. Tommy nodded solemnly, absorbing the lesson with the same seriousness he'd shown throughout the day. Bill smiled, seeing in his grandson's eyes the same quiet determination that had once defined his own approach to leadership. Come on, he said, opening the truck door. Your parents will be waiting, and I don't know about you, but all this talk has made me hungry. Together, they walked into the diner, the desert sun and sand far away in time and space. But the lessons of those days, still fresh and vital, passed from one generation to the next. Chapter 5, Kaizaku Uranium. The diner buzzed with early evening activity as William Harrington and his grandson settled into a corner booth. Tommy's parents wouldn't arrive for another few minutes, giving them a brief window for one more conversation. "Grandpa," Tommy said, turning the compass over in his hands beneath the table, "there's something I've been wondering about. At the museum, they mentioned depleted uranium armor on the Abrams, but they didn't explain much about it." Bill nodded slowly. The topic was complex and controversial, not easily reduced to museum placards or superficial explanations. "Depleted uranium," he began, keeping his voice low, "is one of the most effective armor materials ever developed. It's also one of the most misunderstood." He explained how uranium, after having the most radioactive isotopes removed for nuclear applications, retained extraordinary physical properties. Nearly twice as dense as lead, with unique self-sharpening characteristics when formed into penetrator rounds, it had revolutionized both offensive and defensive tank technology. The Abrams front turret armor, what we call the cheeks, contained depleted uranium mesh layered between steel plates and ceramic materials, Bill said, created a composite armor that could defeat almost any anti-tank round in existence. Tommy leaned forward, fascinated. "But isn't uranium radioactive? Weren't you worried about radiation?" Bill had expected the question. It was the first thing most people asked, influenced by decades of nuclear fears and sensationalized reporting. "That's where the confusion begins," he replied carefully. "Depleted uranium is minimally radioactive, less than many natural materials. You'd get more radiation from certain granite countertops or from flying in an airplane at high altitude." What he didn't mention was the heated debates that had occurred within military circles about long-term exposure effects. The scientific consensus supported his statement, but controversy had persisted nonetheless. "The real concern with depleted uranium isn't radiation," Bill continued. "It's chemical toxicity if it enters the body, similar to lead poisoning. That's why handling procedures were so strict." Tommy considered this information. "But I read online that soldiers got sick from depleted uranium in Iraq. Gulf War syndrome, like you mentioned." Bill sighed inwardly. The internet's ability to preserve and propagate outdated theories sometimes complicated these discussions. There were many theories about Gulf War syndrome, he acknowledged. Depleted uranium was one of them. But extensive studies found little evidence supporting that specific connection. He described how he'd become personally involved in the investigation after Frank's illness, how he'd researched the issue extensively, consulted with medical experts, and eventually participated in a Department of Defense study examining potential causes. "I needed answers," Bill said simply, "not just for Frank, but for all the men suffering similar symptoms. If depleted uranium was responsible, I wanted to know, wanted accountability." What he discovered had surprised him. The investigation had led not to the tank's armor or ammunition, but to a seemingly innocuous maintenance product. "In the desert, we used a specialized solvent to clean sensitive equipment," Bill explained, "particularly effective for removing the fine sand from electronic components. We used it daily without protective equipment because the safety data indicated it was non-toxic." Subsequent research had revealed the solvent contained chemical compounds that, while harmless under normal conditions, degraded under extreme heat and UV exposure, precisely the conditions present in the Middle East. "The degraded compound was absorbed through skin contact and inhalation," Bill continued. "Laboratory testing found it could cause neurological symptoms similar to what many veterans experienced." Tommy's eyes widened. "So it wasn't the uranium at all?" "For many cases, no," Bill confirmed, "though Gulf War syndrome likely had multiple causes, not just one smoking gun. The human body is complex, and war exposes soldiers to countless potential hazards." What mattered most to Bill had been the response. Once the connection was established, he'd lobbied aggressively for recognition and treatment. The solvent had been removed from military inventories, handling protocols for similar products had been revised, and affected veterans had gained access to specialized care programs. "The lesson, Tommy, is that the obvious villain isn't always the real threat." Bill tapped the table for emphasis. "Easy answers make good headlines, but poor science. The truth requires patience, evidence, and an open mind." He'd applied that philosophy throughout his military career, questioning assumptions, examining evidence, forming conclusions based on facts rather than fears or preconceptions. It had made him an effective tank commander, and later a successful advocate for veterans' health. As for depleted uranium itself, Bill concluded, it saved countless American lives. The protection it provided allowed crews to survive hits that would have been fatal with conventional armor. The diner door opened and Tommy's parents entered. Bill waved them over, the conversation pausing as greetings were exchanged and menus distributed. When Tommy's father asked about their museum visit, the boy launched into an enthusiastic recounting of what he'd learned, his eyes bright with newfound knowledge. Bill watched proudly, noting how Tommy carefully explained the technical aspects of tank operations, the fire control system, the turbine engine, the composite armor. The boy had absorbed everything, processing it through his young but keen intellect. Dad was just telling me about the investigation into Gulf War syndrome, Tommy said eventually, turning to his grandfather for confirmation. About how they found it wasn't the uranium that made people sick. Tommy's father raised an eyebrow. Heavy conversation for a 12-year-old, Dad. Bill shrugged slightly. He asked good questions, deserved honest answers. That's Grandpa's specialty, Tommy declared confidently. Honest answers. The adults chuckled, but Bill felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee he was sipping. The boy's respect meant more to him than any military decoration he'd ever received. As dinner proceeded, the conversation shifted to lighter topics: school activities, upcoming holidays, neighborhood news. But Bill noticed how Tommy occasionally touched the pocket containing the compass, as though reassuring himself it was still there. The physical connection to history, to legacy, to the stories he'd heard today. After the meal, as they prepared to depart, Tommy surprised his grandfather with a hug, rare for a boy on the cusp of teenage independence. Thanks for today, Grandpa, he said quietly, for telling me everything. The real stuff, not just the easy parts. Bill returned the embrace, emotion tightening his throat momentarily. That's what grandfathers are for, Tommy, to pass on the truth, not just the glory, the whole story, not just the highlights. As they walked to the parking lot, Tommy's father fell into step beside Bill, letting his wife and son move ahead. You really told him everything, he asked, concern evident in his voice, about the war, the health issues, all of it? Bill considered the question carefully. I told him what he was ready to hear, what he needed to know to understand the reality behind the museum displays and history books. Tommy's father nodded slowly. I guess he's getting to that age, starting to see the world as it is, not just as we wish it were. Better he learns the complex truths from someone who lived them, Bill replied, than the simplified versions from those who didn't. They watched as Tommy demonstrated something to his mother, mimicking the loader's position in a tank turret, his movements precise despite never having performed the actual task. The boy had a natural aptitude for mechanical concepts, a gift for visualization that reminded Bill of his own youth. He reminds me of you, Tommy's father said, echoing Bill's thoughts. The way his mind works, the questions he asks, the intensity when something captures his interest. Bill nodded, feeling the familiar mixture of pride and concern that accompanied any comparison between generations. Pride in the continuation of family traits, concern for the burdens such traits might bring. Just promise me one thing, Dad, Tommy's father continued, his voice dropping lower. If he ever talks about following in your footsteps, about military service, you'll tell him everything. The cost as well as the honor. The reality, not just the romance. Bill placed a hand on his son's shoulder, understanding the fear behind the request. I promise. No glorification, no recruitment speech, just the truth, good and bad. He'll make his own decisions, but they'll be informed ones. They rejoined Tommy and his mother, the family preparing to go their separate ways. The younger Harringtons to their home in Columbus, Bill to his small ranch outside the city. As they exchanged final goodbyes, Tommy hung back a moment. Grandpa, he said hesitantly, could I come back tomorrow? There's still so much I want to ask about. Bill glanced at the boy's parents, who nodded their permission. Of course, he replied, we've barely scratched the surface. Tommy grinned, excitement evident in his expression. Can we talk about the urban operations next, about fighting in cities? The museum didn't have much about that. Bill recognized the genuine interest behind the request. Not morbid fascination, but the same technical and tactical curiosity that had driven his own career. Tomorrow morning, he agreed, 9 o'clock, we'll cover urban operations, close quarters combat, the whole package. As he watched the family drive away, Bill felt a complex mixture of emotions. Satisfaction at having shared his experiences, concern about the aspects yet to be discussed, hope that the lessons would be properly understood. Above all, a deep appreciation for the bridge being built between generations, a bridge constructed of shared knowledge, mutual respect, and honest communication. He climbed into his truck and headed home, mind already organizing tomorrow's stories, particularly the most difficult one, the one that had defined his understanding of urban warfare and of leadership itself. The Baghdad mission that had nearly ended his career but had ultimately earned him unexpected recognition. Some stories carried their weight in steel, and this was one of them. But Tommy was ready to hear it, ready to understand that sometimes the greatest acts of courage occurred not in the heat of battle, but in the crucible of moral choice. Chapter 6, Why Did You Vohin? Morning dawned clear and warm as William Harrington prepared for his grandson's visit. He'd risen early, retrieving boxes from the attic, materials he hadn't examined in years. Maps, journals, photographs, the tangible remnants of his time in combat. He arranged selected items on the dining room table, a marked map of Baghdad, a dog-eared field notebook, several photographs, and a framed citation. Evidence of the most challenging and consequential mission of his career. The doorbell rang precisely at 9. Tommy stood on the porch, backpack over his shoulder, eager anticipation evident in his stance. Right on time, Bill said, stepping aside to welcome the boy. Military punctuality, I approve. Tommy entered, immediately noticing the materials on the table. Are those from Iraq? Bill nodded. From the urban operations you asked about, specifically from Baghdad, April 2003. He led his grandson to the table, pulling out chairs for them both. The items between them represented more than historical artifacts. They embodied a turning point in Bill's understanding of warfare, of leadership, of the moral complexities that battlefield manuals never adequately addressed. Urban combat is different from open desert warfare, Bill began, his voice taking on the measured cadence of an instructor. Different terrain, different tactics, different risks. He unfolded the map, revealing a section of Baghdad marked with operational boundaries, unit positions, and handwritten notations. The faded lines and symbols represented the framework within which life and death decisions had been made 2 decades earlier. After the main phase of Iraqi freedom, our mission changed, Bill explained, from defeating conventional forces to security operations, maintaining order, preventing insurgent activity, protecting civilian infrastructure. Thunder Road had been assigned to a mixed battalion task force responsible for securing a sector of the city. Their specific mission had been to locate and neutralize Iraqi armor that intelligence indicated was hidden throughout the urban area. The Republican Guard had dispersed their remaining tanks among civilian structures. Bill continued, tracing a finger along one of the city blocks. Schools, hospitals, apartment buildings, places they knew we'd be reluctant to target with heavy weapons. Tommy studied the map, brow furrowed in concentration. That's against the rules of war, right? Using civilian places as shields? It is, Bill confirmed. But our obligation to protect civilians doesn't diminish just because the enemy ignores their obligations. He described how Thunder Road had led a small detachment, 2 other Abrams, and an infantry squad in Bradley fighting vehicles, on a reconnaissance mission through their assigned sector. Intelligence had indicated at least 3 T-72s concealed in the neighborhood. Urban terrain negates many of the Abrams' advantages, Bill explained. Limited visibility, restricted movement, confined spaces that force close-range engagements where our superior optics and range don't matter as much. The detachment had moved cautiously, maintaining radio discipline, using buildings for cover when possible. Infantry teams had cleared critical intersections ahead of the tanks, establishing security positions to protect against RPG teams, the greatest threat to armored vehicles in urban environments. We'd been operating for about 3 hours when we got the first indication of enemy armor, Bill continued, pointing to a marked position on the map. One of our infantry scouts reported track marks leading into what appeared to be a school complex. Tommy leaned closer, examining the notation. Did you attack right away? Bill shook his head. Urban operations require patience and precision. We established a perimeter and conducted further reconnaissance. Needed to confirm the target and assess the civilian situation before determining our approach. The infantry had reported that the school appeared vacant, no visible civilian presence. But something about the situation had troubled Bill. The neighborhood, while subdued, showed signs of habitation. Markets were open, albeit with limited goods. Children could be seen in some areas. It seemed unlikely that a school would be completely abandoned. I made the decision to investigate personally, Bill said, left the tank under Frank's command, and joined the infantry squad for a closer look. It had been a calculated risk. Tank commanders typically remained with their vehicles. But Bill had needed ground-level intelligence that couldn't be obtained from inside the Abrams. The school consisted of 3 buildings around a central courtyard, he explained, sketching the layout on a notepad. Main academic building, administration block, and what appeared to be a dormitory or housing facility. Moving with the infantry team, Bill had approached the complex from the least exposed angle. The evidence of armored vehicles was clear. Track marks, disturbed earth, a section of wall damaged in a way consistent with a tank's passage. We entered through a side entrance, using standard clearing procedures, Bill continued. The first floor of the main building was empty, desks stacked against walls, classrooms bare. Looked like it had been hastily evacuated. Tommy listened intently, occasionally glancing at the map as though trying to place himself in the scene. As we moved deeper into the building, we heard sounds from the basement level, Bill said, his voice dropping slightly. Voices, movement. The team leader and I exchanged looks. This complicated things significantly. Using hand signals, they had deployed the squad to secure their position, while Bill and the team leader advanced toward the basement stairs. The sounds had grown clearer, multiple voices, the cries of children, the distinct tone of someone giving instructions. We found 43 civilians in that basement, Bill said quietly, mostly women and children, locals who had sought shelter from the fighting. They were being detained by 3 armed men, not regular Iraqi military, but some kind of paramilitary or militia. The situation had transformed instantly from a straightforward enemy armor hunt to a complex hostage scenario. Worse, through a partially open doorway at the back of the basement, Bill had glimpsed the distinctive outline of a T-72's turret. The tank had been driven into what appeared to be a large maintenance area beneath the school. Standard procedure called for withdrawal, report to higher command, wait for specialized forces to handle the hostage element, Bill acknowledged. But those civilians were in immediate danger, and we had surprise on our side. Tommy's eyes widened. What did you do? Made the hardest call of my career. Bill's gaze grew distant, seeing not the dining room but that tense basement from decades ago. Authorized an immediate action to secure the civilians and neutralize the threat. The operation had unfolded with the controlled violence that characterized well-executed infantry action. The squad had breached the basement from 2 entry points simultaneously, using flashbang grenades to disorient the armed guards. Precise rifle fire had eliminated the threat before the militia members could react against their hostages. Within 30 seconds, we had control of the basement, Bill continued, but we still had a T-72 with unknown crew status less than 50 meters away and terrified civilians to evacuate. He divided the infantry team, half escorting civilians to safety, half establishing security toward the maintenance area. Meanwhile, he'd radioed Frank with specific instructions for repositioning Thunder Road to cover the most likely exit route for the enemy tank. The T-72 crew must have heard the commotion, Bill said. We could hear them starting the engine, preparing to move, but they were in a difficult position. The maintenance bay had only one exit large enough for a tank, and that led directly into the courtyard. With Thunder Road positioned to cover that exit and infantry teams securing the basement, they had established a tactical advantage, but the situation remained precarious. If the T-72 attempted to fight its way out, the ensuing battle could cause structural damage to the school, potentially endangering civilians still being evacuated. I needed to end the situation quickly with minimal risk, Bill explained, so I did something that wasn't in any tactical manual. Using an Arabic-speaking member of the infantry squad, he had called out to the tank crew using the school's internal communication system. The message had been simple. They were surrounded by superior forces. The civilians were being evacuated. They had 2 minutes to surrender, or the Abrams would open fire directly into the maintenance bay. It was a calculated risk, Bill admitted. If they were hardline Republican Guard, they might choose to fight anyway. But I suspected they were regular Army, men who had been abandoned by their command, who recognized the war was effectively over. Tommy leaned forward. Did it work? Bill nodded. 90 seconds later, 3 Iraqi tankers emerged with hands raised. No shots fired, no additional risk to the civilians. What he didn't describe was the moment when the enemy tank commander had approached him after surrendering, how the man had thanked him in broken English for the opportunity to end his war honorably, for the chance to return someday to his family. We secured the T-72, completed the civilian evacuation, and reported the situation to battalion, Bill concluded. Standard procedure would have been to destroy the enemy tank in place, but that risked damaging the school. Instead, we brought in a recovery vehicle later and removed it intact. The map before them showed none of these details, just the clinical notation of enemy armor neutralized at the location. But the human drama, the split-second decisions, the moral calculus performed under pressure, these were the elements that defined combat leadership. The real challenge came afterward, Bill said, his expression tightening slightly, when I had to explain to the battalion commander why I deviated from standard operating procedure. Tommy's brow furrowed. But you saved the civilians, captured the enemy tank, accomplished the mission without casualties. Military operations follow protocols for good reason, Bill explained. When commanders start improvising, it can lead to confusion, coordination problems, unnecessary risks. My superior officer had legitimate concerns about my decision-making. The battalion commander had been particularly troubled by Bill's choice to personally participate in the infantry operation, leaving his tank, entering an unsecured building, exposing himself to capture or death. Such actions, while perhaps brave, violated the command structure and risk assessment protocols that governed operations. I faced potential disciplinary action, Bill admitted, possible relief from command. At minimum, a formal reprimand that would end any chance of further advancement. Tommy looked shocked. That's not fair. You did the right thing. In war, Tommy, right has many dimensions. Bill's voice was gentle but firm. Tactically right, strategically right, morally right. Sometimes these align perfectly, often they don't. He pulled forward the framed citation that had been sitting at the edge of the table. The official letterhead of the United States Army was visible at the top, followed by formal language and signatures at the bottom. 2 weeks after the incident, I was called to division headquarters, Bill continued, expected to receive official notification of disciplinary action. Instead, I was presented with this. The citation details the school operation, commending Bill for exceptional judgment, moral courage, and tactical innovation resulting in the successful rescue of 43 civilian hostages and the neutralization of enemy armor assets without friendly casualties. The division commander had reviewed the after-action reports and witness statements, Bill explained. He determined that while I had deviated from standard procedure, the situation had warranted flexibility, and my decisions had saved lives while accomplishing the mission objectives. Tommy read the citation with growing amazement. So instead of getting in trouble, you got an award? A Bronze Star with V device for valor, Bill confirmed. But more importantly, the division incorporated elements of our approach into the standard operating procedures for similar situations. They recognized that rigid adherence to protocol sometimes needs to yield to ground-level judgment. What he didn't mention was how that incident had altered his career trajectory, how it had marked him as someone who could balance mission requirements with ethical considerations, who could make difficult decisions under pressure, how it had eventually led to his selection for advanced leadership training and subsequent promotion to higher command responsibilities. The lesson, Tommy, is that rules and procedures exist for good reasons, but they can't anticipate every situation. Bill tapped the citation for emphasis. Leadership sometimes means having the courage to deviate from the expected path when circumstances demand it, and being prepared to accept the consequences of those decisions, good or bad. Tommy studied his grandfather with newfound appreciation. Is that why you always talk about moral courage being as important as physical courage? Bill nodded, pleased that the boy had made the connection. Exactly. Physical courage, the willingness to face danger, is vital in combat. But moral courage, the willingness to do what's right despite potential personal cost, that's what separates great leaders from merely adequate ones. He gathered the materials from the table, carefully returning them to their folders. These artifacts of war, the map, the citation, the photographs, represented not just historical events, but the evolution of his understanding of leadership, of duty, of the complex interplay between military necessity and human compassion. Urban operations taught me that the greatest threat isn't always visible, Bill said, closing the folder. Not the enemy tank or the RPG team or the IED. Sometimes it's the moral ambiguity, the lack of clear guidance, the competing priorities that force you to rely on your own judgment and values. Tommy nodded solemnly, processing this wisdom with the seriousness it deserved. That's why character matters more than tactics, Bill concluded. Why who you are is ultimately more important than what you know or what equipment you operate. Because when the situation exceeds your training and experience, as it inevitably will, character is what guides your decisions. He looked at his grandson, seeing in those young eyes the same thoughtfulness, the same capacity for nuanced understanding that had served Bill throughout his military career. Whatever path Tommy chose, whether it included military service or led in entirely different directions, that quality would serve him well. So, Bill said, lightening his tone slightly, any other questions about urban operations? Tommy grinned. About 1 million, but I think I understand the most important part now. Which is? The tanks aren't just about armor and guns, Tommy replied. They're about the people inside them, making hard decisions when everything is complicated. Bill smiled, a surge of pride warming his chest. Exactly right. The most important armor isn't the depleted uranium or composite plates. It's what you carry inside, your values, your judgment, your commitment to doing what's right even when it's difficult. He stood, gesturing toward the kitchen. How about some lunch before we continue? Can't discuss tactical operations on an empty stomach. As they moved to prepare sandwiches, Bill reflected on the morning's conversation. He'd wanted Tommy to understand the realities of combat beyond the sanitized museum displays and simplified historical accounts. The complexity, the ambiguity, the weight of decisions that affected lives beyond one's own. But more importantly, he'd wanted to convey the fundamental truth that had guided his career from Thunder Road to retirement. That technology and tactics were merely tools. The true measure of a soldier, of a leader, of a human being, lay in how those tools were employed, in service to what principles, guided by what moral compass. Judging by the thoughtfulness in Tommy's expression as they continued their conversation over lunch, that message had been received. And that, more than any medal or commendation, was the legacy Bill most hoped to leave, not just with his grandson, but with all those whose lives he touched. The stories would continue, the lessons would unfold, the bond between generations would strengthen. But the essential understanding that had been established, that in war as in peace, character was the foundation upon which all else was built. That truth, like the compass now carried in Tommy's pocket, would guide the boy's journey wherever it might lead. The summer heat shimmered above the driveway as William Harrington loaded fishing gear into his truck. 2 days had passed since his conversations with Tommy, days filled with phone calls to old comrades and hours spent sorting through memorabilia. The reminiscing had awakened something in him, a restlessness, a pull toward unfinished business. Tommy sat on the front porch steps, watching his grandfather's methodical preparations. The boy had arrived an hour earlier, eager for their planned fishing expedition, but Bill sensed there were questions still percolating in that young mind. "Grandpa," Tommy finally ventured, "you never told me about the Second Iraq War. Were you there too?" Bill secured the tackle box before answering. Some memories required proper framing. "Not as a tank commander," he replied, closing the truck's tailgate. "By 2003, I'd moved up to staff positions, different responsibilities." He motioned for Tommy to join him on the porch swing, deciding the fishing trip could wait a few minutes. This conversation deserved his full attention. After Desert Storm, the Army went through significant changes, Bill explained, settling onto the swing. New technologies, new threats, new doctrine. The Abrams itself evolved, upgraded fire control systems, improved armor, digital communications. The M1A2 had represented a quantum leap forward, transformed from an analog fighting platform to a digital node in an integrated battlefield network. Targeting data shared instantly between vehicles, real-time intelligence from aerial assets, enhanced situational awareness for commanders at all levels. By the time Operation Iraqi Freedom began in March 2003, I was a lieutenant colonel, Bill continued. Battalion executive officer, primarily handling logistics and personnel, the unglamorous but essential background work that keeps fighting units operational. He'd watched the invasion from headquarters tents, tracking unit movements on digital displays, coordinating supply chains, managing the 1,000 details that combat operations required. Not the adrenaline-fueled experience of frontline combat, but vital nonetheless. "I've been scheduled to rotate back stateside in May," Bill said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "Had plans to request a training command position at Fort Knox. Thought my days in the sandbox were finished." Tommy shifted on the swing, sensing the story's turning point. "But they weren't?" Bill shook his head slowly. April 22nd, 2003. I was in my quarters when the battalion commander called me in. Said division had a special assignment that required my particular experience. The division commander, a major general who had served with the Bill in Desert Storm, had identified a critical gap in the transition from invasion to occupation. The young officers leading tank companies into Baghdad lacked urban combat experience, particularly in the complex environment of a partially hostile city. The general had reviewed after-action reports from my Thunder Road days, Bill explained, specifically my experience with the urban operations and civilian protection protocols. He wanted me to develop and implement a rapid training program for company-grade officers currently operating in Baghdad. The assignment represented a significant deviation from his planned career path, an unexpected return to operational status when he'd been preparing for stateside rotation. But the need was clear, the mission vital. Within 48 hours, I was on a C-130 headed back to Iraq, Bill continued. Back to the dust and heat, back to the country we thought we'd finished with in '91. Baghdad, in spring 2003, had been a city of contradictions. Liberation and occupation, gratitude and resentment, order and chaos existing side by side. American forces, trained primarily for conventional combat, had found themselves thrust into urban peacekeeping, counterinsurgency, and civil affairs operations for which they had limited preparation. My mission was straightforward but challenging, Bill said. Develop practical guidance for tank commanders operating in urban environments. Transfer the lessons of Desert Storm and the early phase of Iraqi freedom to the officers responsible for daily operations. He'd established a mobile training team, traveling between company positions throughout Baghdad and its surroundings. Using actual city maps, recent incident reports, and his own combat experience, he'd conducted intensive workshops for tank commanders and platoon leaders. The biggest challenge wasn't tactical, Bill reflected. These were smart, well-trained officers. The challenge was psychological, helping them understand that the mindset that had served them well during the invasion needed adjustment for occupation duties. Tommy tilted his head questioningly. Different mindset how? During invasion, the mission parameters are clear. Defeat enemy forces, secure objectives, advance along designated routes, Bill explained. During occupation, everything becomes more ambiguous. Is that civilian approaching your checkpoint, carrying groceries or an IED? Is that gathering a peaceful market or an insurgent meeting? Is that vehicle slowing down out of respect for your patrol or because the driver is preparing to attack? The young officers he'd mentored had struggled with this ambiguity, the lack of clear front lines, the blending of combatants with civilian populations, the constant need to calibrate response appropriate to unclear threats. I focused on 3 core principles, Bill said, tapping his fingers for emphasis. Protection of civilians as the highest priority after force protection. Measured response appropriate to confirmed threats. And constant situational awareness beyond the immediate tactical environment. He conducted practical exercises, scenario-based training using actual city locations, incorporating recent incidents and intelligence assessments. The officers had responded well, hungry for guidance that bridged the gap between their training and the realities they faced daily. One captain in particular showed exceptional promise, Bill continued, a faint smile touching his lips. Kevin Martinez, smart, adaptable, deeply committed to his men. Reminded me of myself at that age, but with a unique perspective I hadn't possessed. Captain Martinez had commanded a tank company responsible for securing a particularly challenging district, a mixed Sunni-Shia neighborhood with competing militias and frequent attacks on American forces. Despite the difficulties, his company had maintained better relations with local leaders and experienced fewer hostile incidents than comparable units. I spent extra time with Martinez, observing his operations, reviewing his tactics, Bill said. Wanted to understand what made him effective where others struggled. The answer had proven both simple and profound. Unlike many officers who maintained professional distance from the Iraqi population, Martinez had invested in understanding the community under his responsibility. He'd learned rudimentary Arabic, met regularly with neighborhood leaders, and ensured his men understood local customs and sensitivities. Martinez told me something I'll never forget, Bill said, his voice softening with the memory. Sir, we're not just securing streets and buildings. We're securing people's lives, their hopes, their futures. If we forget that, we've already lost. The wisdom had struck Bill deeply, a young captain articulating a truth that many senior officers had yet to grasp. The insight had shaped the remainder of his training program, emphasizing that effective urban operations required understanding the human terrain as thoroughly as the physical environment. I extended my deployment to continue working with Martinez and his company, Bill admitted, requested permission to develop them as a model unit, demonstrating best practices for tank operations in urban environments. Tommy's eyes widened slightly. You stayed longer in Iraq just to work with this captain? Bill nodded. Some people you meet in life have that special quality, a natural gift for leadership, for innovation, for seeing beyond conventional wisdom. Martinez was one of those people, worth investing in. Over the following months, Bill had embedded with Martinez's company, documenting their approaches, refining procedures, creating training materials for wider distribution. The partnership had proven highly effective, with Martinez's methods gradually adopted by other units operating in similar environments. One day during a community meeting in his area of operations, I noticed something unusual about Martinez, Bill continued. The way he interacted with the local elders, his understanding of their customs and concerns, seemed deeper than even his language skills could explain. After the meeting over coffee in Martinez's command post, Bill had asked about his background. The answer had stunned him. Martinez revealed that his father was Iraqi, Bill said, watching Tommy's reaction carefully, a former tank officer in the Republican Guard who had surrendered to American forces in 1991 and eventually emigrated to the United States. Tommy's jaw dropped slightly. During Desert Storm, but that means, Bill nodded slowly. Yes, Martinez's father had been one of the T-72 commanders who surrendered to Thunder Road during our first major engagement. The revelation had shocked Bill. The statistical improbability of such a connection, the cosmic symmetry of finding himself mentoring the son of a man whose life his own decisions had altered decades earlier. Martinez's father had told him stories about the American tank commander who had given him the opportunity to surrender honorably, Bill continued, who had treated him with dignity, ensured his proper processing as a prisoner of war. Those stories had influenced Martinez's decision to join the Army, to become a tank officer himself. Tommy leaned forward, completely captivated. Did you tell him it was you? That you were that commander? I did, Bill acknowledged. He was as stunned as I had been. Said it felt like destiny that we should end up working together. The connection had transformed their professional relationship into something deeper. A shared legacy, a continuation of a story begun in the desert 12 years earlier. Martinez had introduced Bill to his mother during a video call, and she had confirmed the details. How her husband had spoken often of the American officer who had changed the course of his life. Martinez's father had passed away 2 years before. Cancer, Bill said somberly. But his influence lived on in his son's approach to duty, to leadership, to the Iraqi people under his protection. The coincidence, if such profound connections could be called mere coincidence, had reinforced Bill's belief in the ripple effects of individual decisions. How choosing mercy over destruction, respect over humiliation, had echoed forward through time in ways he could never have anticipated. That's when I truly understood the concept of legacy, Bill told his grandson. Not just passing on knowledge or possessions, but how our actions create patterns that continue long after we're gone. How treating one enemy soldier with dignity could years later result in an American officer better equipped to build peace in that same soldier's homeland. Tommy absorbed this with the thoughtful expression that Bill had come to recognize as the boy processing complex ideas. Is that why you agreed to help develop the M1A3? Tommy asked, making a connection Bill hadn't expected. Because of legacy? Bill smiled, impressed by his grandson's intuition. That's exactly right. The lessons we learned in urban combat, the innovations Martinez and I developed together, they needed to be incorporated into the next generation of the Abrams. Not just better technology, but better philosophy. He described how, following his extended deployment, he had been approached by the Abrams System Program Office, the organization responsible for developing future iterations of the tank. They had requested his participation in the early conceptual phase of what would eventually become the M1A3. They wanted practical combat experience informing the design from the beginning, Bill explained. Not just technical specifications, but insights into how tanks actually operated in contemporary environments, particularly urban settings. The assignment had represented yet another unexpected turn in his career, a shift from operational leadership to systems development. But the opportunity to influence the future of American armored warfare had been too significant to decline. I spent 18 months working with engineers, analysts, and other combat veterans, Bill continued, translating battlefield lessons into design requirements, advocating for changes that would make the next generation Abrams more effective in the complex environments of modern conflict. His contributions had focused particularly on urban operations capabilities, enhanced visibility systems, improved close quarters maneuverability, better integration with dismounted infantry, and more precise fire control for operations amid civilian structures. The experience taught me that innovation isn't just about technology, Bill reflected. It's about understanding how humans use that technology, how it shapes their decisions, how it enables or constrains their options in critical moments. Tommy nodded thoughtfully. Like how you modified Thunder Road's maintenance schedule based on actual desert conditions, not just what the manual said. Bill smiled, pleased by the connection. Exactly. The best equipment reflects the wisdom of those who use it daily, not just the theories of those who design it. He glanced at his watch, suddenly aware of how much time had passed. We should probably head to the lake if we want to catch anything today. They rose from the porch swing, but Tommy had one more question. Did Captain Martinez stay in the Army? Do you still keep in touch? He did and we do, Bill replied, leading the way to the truck. He's Lieutenant Colonel Martinez now, commanding a battalion at Fort Hood. We speak monthly. He's got a son about your age, Michael, named after my loader from Thunder Road. As they climbed into the truck and headed toward the lake, Bill reflected on the curious symmetry of his life, how the circles of influence had expanded outward from Thunder Road's tracks across decades and generations. The young tank commander he had once been would never have imagined how his decisions would echo forward, creating connections that transcended conflicts and continents. The fishing gear rattled in the back as they drove, but Bill's mind remained on tanks and deserts, on choices made under pressure, on the mysterious ways that professional duty and personal legacy intertwined across the years. There was more to tell Tommy about the M1A3's development, about his classified contributions to armored doctrine, about the future of tank warfare in an increasingly complex world. But that could wait for another day. For now, it was enough that the boy understood the heart of the matter, that tanks were ultimately about people, those who operated them, those affected by them, those protected or endangered by the decisions made within their steel confines. The road stretched before them, leading away from memories and toward new experiences. But the compass of the past still guided their journey, pointing toward truths that neither time nor technology could alter. Chapter 8, Thep Kutung Line. The following weekend found William Harrington and his grandson in an unexpected location, the basement workshop of Bill's ranch house. What had begun as a rainy day conversation about tank design had evolved into an impromptu lesson on the future of armored warfare. Bill cleared space on his workbench, laying out detailed technical journals, classified documents now declassified with time, and his own notebooks from the M1A3 development program. The materials represented the culmination of his professional expertise, the point where combat experience met engineering innovation. The Abrams was revolutionary when it first entered service in 1980, Bill began, opening one of the journals to a marked page. But warfare evolves constantly. What was dominant yesterday becomes vulnerable today. The challenge is anticipating tomorrow's threats and adapting before they emerge. Tommy leaned over the materials, fascinated by the technical diagrams and performance specifications. The boy had his grandfather's mechanical aptitude, the ability to understand complex systems intuitively, to visualize how components interacted. The M1A3 program began with a fundamental question, Bill continued. What environments would American tanks face in the coming decades? And what capabilities would they need to dominate those environments? The answer had emerged from careful analysis of global trends: urbanization, technological proliferation, asymmetric warfare, and the changing nature of international conflicts. Future tanks would need to operate effectively across a spectrum from high-intensity conventional warfare to complex counterinsurgency operations in densely populated areas. We identified 4 critical areas for advancement, Bill explained, tapping each point on a document as he enumerated them: protection systems, precision firepower, information integration, and reduced logistical footprint. He detailed how the M1A3 had represented a significant evolution in each area. Advanced composite armor incorporating third-generation depleted uranium mesh, a modified 120mm smoothbore gun with enhanced accuracy and range, digital battle management systems that networked each tank with other vehicles, aircraft, and command centers, and a hybrid propulsion system that reduced fuel consumption without sacrificing performance. But the most revolutionary aspect wasn't in the specifications, Bill said, pulling forward a notebook filled with his own handwriting. It was in the philosophy behind the design, the recognition that future tanks needed to be more than just fighting platforms. They needed to be information nodes, civil affairs enablers, and psychological operations tools. This perspective, unusual among traditional armor officers, had emerged directly from his experiences with Captain Martinez in Baghdad. How a tank's presence could calm or inflame a neighborhood. How its capabilities could enable precision operations that minimize civilian impacts. How its communication systems could facilitate interaction with local populations rather than just coordination with other military assets. I advocated for design elements that many traditional armor officers considered unnecessary, Bill admitted. Enhanced external communication systems to interact with civilians without requiring crews to expose themselves. Multiple spectrum visibility tools that could distinguish combatants from non-combatants in complex environments. Adjustable weapon systems that could scale from non-lethal to maximum lethality depending on the situation. Tommy studied a conceptual drawing in one of the journals, a modified Abrams with elements that distinguished it from the versions he'd seen in the museum. Did they actually include your ideas in the final design? Bill smiled, a mixture of pride and modesty in his expression. Some, not all. Military procurement is always a compromise between visionary concepts and practical constraints. Budget limitations, technological readiness, institutional resistance to change, all play a role in determining what actually reaches production. Nevertheless, his influence on the program had been substantial. The M1A3, when finally fielded, had incorporated several features that traced directly to his recommendations, particularly in the realm of urban operations capabilities and crew interfaces designed around human factors research. The most significant contribution wasn't a specific technology, Bill explained, but a design philosophy, that the tank of the future needed to be a system that enhanced human judgment rather than replacing it. That no matter how advanced the fire control computer or threat detection sensors, the critical element remained the crew. Their training, their decision-making, their ethical framework. This philosophy had run counter to certain trends within the defense establishment, particularly the push toward automated systems, reduced crew requirements, and artificial intelligence applications in combat vehicles. Bill had argued persistently for maintaining the four-person crew, for ensuring that critical decisions remained in human hands, for designing systems that augmented rather than diminished the role of trained soldiers. I lost some battles, he acknowledged. Automation did replace certain crew functions, but I won the most important one, keeping a human commander in the decision loop for weapons employment, ensuring that lethal force remained under direct human control. Tommy frowned slightly, processing this information. But wouldn't automated systems be more accurate, make fewer mistakes? Technical accuracy isn't the issue, Bill replied, pleased by the thoughtful question. Machines can compute ballistic solutions more precisely than humans. They don't fatigue or experience combat stress. But warfare isn't just about technical accuracy. It's about judgment, about context, about ethical considerations that can't be reduced to algorithms. He described scenarios from his own experience. The school in Baghdad, with civilians in the basement, the Iraqi tank crew surrendering to retrieve personal belongings, the split-second decisions that required not just tactical assessment, but moral reasoning. No machine could have made those judgment calls, Bill insisted. They required human intuition, human empathy, human understanding of consequences beyond the immediate tactical situation. His advocacy on this point had earned him both admirers and critics within the defense establishment. Some had labeled him a traditionalist, resistant to progress. Others had recognized the wisdom in his balanced approach, acknowledging the value of technological advancement while preserving the essential human element in warfare. There's something else you should know about the M1A3 program, Bill said, lowering his voice slightly even though they were alone in the workshop. something that wasn't publicly acknowledged but represents perhaps my most significant contribution. He opened a drawer beneath the workbench and withdrew a sealed folder, its edges worn with age but its contents clearly still valued. The cover bore no dramatic classified markings, just a project code name and date from 15 years earlier. During the development process, I was asked to consult on a classified project related to crew protection, Bill explained, carefully opening the folder. Specifically on active protection systems, technologies designed to intercept incoming projectiles before they strike the tank's armor. Active protection systems had existed in concept for decades. The Soviet Union had deployed early versions on their T-80 tanks, and Israel had pioneered more advanced systems for their Merkava tanks. But American efforts had lagged, partly due to technical challenges and partly due to doctrinal resistance. The conventional approach involved radar detection of incoming threats, followed by either explosive countermeasures or kinetic interceptors. Bill continued, revealing technical drawings within the folder. Effective in certain scenarios, but with significant limitations in urban environments or against advanced munitions. He'd approached the problem differently, drawing on his battlefield experience and understanding of real-world threats rather than theoretical attack profiles. The result had been a hybrid system that combined multiple detection methods, prioritization algorithms based on threat analysis, and a layered response mechanism that could adapt to different operational environments. The key innovation wasn't technical, Bill said, pointing to a flowchart he'd created. It was conceptual, treating active protection not as a standalone system, but as an integrated element within a comprehensive survivability approach. Detection, avoidance, deception, interception, and absorption working together rather than as separate layers. Tommy studied the diagrams with growing comprehension. So instead of just trying to shoot down incoming missiles, you made the whole tank work together to protect the crew? Exactly, Bill confirmed, pleased by his grandson's understanding. Traditional defense thinking separated active protection, passive armor, signature management, and tactical movement into distinct categories. I argued they should be unified under a single survivability concept. The approach had initially faced resistance from specialists focused on their particular domains. Armor designers worried about integration compromising protection levels. Electronic warfare experts questioned the electromagnetic compatibility of combined systems. Budget analysts balked at the cost implications of such comprehensive integration. But actual combat experience supported the concept, Bill insisted. In Iraq, we'd learned that no single protection method was sufficient against the range of threats we faced. Sometimes the best defense was detecting the enemy before they fired. Sometimes it was rapid movement to avoid targeting. Sometimes it was deceiving their sensors about our actual position. And sometimes it was physically intercepting or absorbing incoming fire. His persistence, backed by detailed analysis of combat incidents and technical feasibility studies, had eventually prevailed. The integrated survivability concept had been adopted for the M1A3 program, leading to a protection system significantly more effective than its predecessors, particularly in complex urban environments. The system underwent extensive testing at Aberdeen Proving Grounds, Bill recalled. They fired everything from RPGs to advanced anti-tank guided missiles at test vehicles equipped with the prototype system. The results exceeded even my expectations. What he didn't mention was how he'd insisted on being present for the critical tests, how he'd stood alongside engineers and program managers as they subjected his design concept to the ultimate evaluation, how he'd felt a complex mixture of professional pride and personal vindication when the system repeatedly defeated threats that would have destroyed earlier tank models. The final production system incorporated about 80% of my original concept, Bill acknowledged. Budget constraints and technology readiness issues required some compromises, but the core philosophy, the integrated approach to survivability, remained intact. When the M1A3 had finally entered service with active units, its enhanced protection capabilities had been among its most significant improvements over previous models. Tankers had quickly recognized the advantage, particularly those deployed to high-threat environments where traditional armor alone proved insufficient against proliferating anti-tank weapons. The official documentation never carried my name, Bill said, carefully returning the folder to its drawer. The system was attributed to the corporate defense contractors who refined and manufactured the components. But within certain circles of the armor branch, its origins were known. Tommy looked at his grandfather with newfound appreciation. You basically invented a system that saves soldiers' lives, and you didn't get credit for it? Bill shrugged slightly. Military service isn't about personal credit, Tommy. It's about contribution to something larger than yourself. Knowing that tankers came home safely because of something I helped create, that's worth more than having my name on a patent or in a technical manual. This philosophy had guided his entire career, from his early days with Thunder Road to his final contributions to American armored warfare. The mission, the men, the future security of the nation, these had always taken precedence over personal recognition or advancement. Besides, Bill added with a small smile, the people who mattered knew. General officers who approved the program, engineers who implemented the concept, and most importantly, the crews whose lives were protected by the system. He began gathering the materials from the workbench, returning journals to shelves and notes to folders. The technical aspects of tank development, while fascinating, represented only part of the story he wanted his grandson to understand. The M1A3 is already being superseded by newer designs, Bill said, closing the last folder. Technology advances, threats evolve, requirements change. That's the nature of military development. But certain principles remain constant across generations of equipment. He turned to Tommy, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. The best weapons are those that enhance rather than replace human judgment. The best protection comes from integrating multiple approaches rather than relying on a single solution. And the best innovations arise from actual battlefield experience, not just theoretical analysis. These principles, distilled from decades of service from tank commander to systems developer, represented Bill's true legacy to American armored warfare. Not specific technologies or tactical procedures, but a philosophy that balanced technological advancement with human wisdom, innovation with practical experience. The future of armor faces significant challenges, Bill acknowledged as they climbed the stairs from the workshop. Precision munitions that can target tanks from beyond visual range, drone swarms that can overwhelm traditional defenses, electromagnetic weapons that can disable electronic systems, urban environments that negate many advantages of heavy armor. Yet he remained confident in the continued relevance of tanks on future battlefields. Their combination of protected firepower, tactical mobility, and psychological impact would ensure their place in combined arms operations for decades to come, albeit in forms that might barely resemble the Abrams he had commanded. The materials change: composite armor instead of rolled steel, depleted uranium instead of tungsten, digital systems instead of analog gauges, Bill said as they reached the main floor of the house. But the fundamental purpose remains constant: to provide protected, mobile firepower in support of national objectives. That continuity across technological generations gave meaning to his career. The sense that his contributions, however small in the grand scheme of military development, formed part of an unbroken line stretching from the first tanks that had crossed no man's land in World War I to whatever armored vehicles would protect American soldiers in the conflicts of tomorrow. Tommy paused before a framed photograph hanging in the hallway. Bill standing beside an early production M1A3, the tank's angular turret and modified hull distinctive from earlier models. Will they ever name one after you? The boy asked. Like they do with generals in famous battles? Bill chuckled softly. No, Tommy, tanks get named after generals in famous battles, not lieutenant colonels who provided input on survivability systems. And that's exactly as it should be. His legacy lived not in named vehicles or mounted plaques, but in the improved capabilities of American armor, in the lives preserved by enhanced protection systems, in the balanced approach to technology and human factors that had influenced a generation of equipment designers. As they moved toward the living room, Bill felt a deep satisfaction that transcended personal recognition. He had contributed to something enduring, had helped shape not just a specific tank model, but the philosophy underlying American armored warfare for decades to come. The rain continued outside, drumming steadily on the roof, but in Bill's mind, he heard instead the rumble of tracks on desert hardpan, the whine of turbine engines at full power, the mechanical symphony of American armor advancing toward objectives only they could secure. It was a sound that connected past and future, linking Thunder Road to whatever tanks would follow the M1A3 into the uncertain conflicts of tomorrow. Chapter 9, Descente. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving behind puddles that reflected the clearing sky. William Harrington sat on his front porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the sunrise paint the eastern horizon in shades of gold and crimson. Days of recounting his experiences had stirred memories that now demanded quiet reflection. The phone call came just after 7, an unexpected but not unwelcome interruption to his solitude. The voice on the other end belonged to Michael Anderson, Thunder Road's loader, now a successful engineering executive with a major defense contractor. "Books," Bill greeted him warmly, using the old nickname. "How's life in the corporate world?" "Profitable but dull," Michael replied with a chuckle. "Nothing like loading 120mm rounds while bouncing through the Iraqi desert. Listen, I'm calling about the reunion next month. James and I were wondering if you'd reconsider attending." The annual gathering of Desert Storm veterans had become a tradition Bill had avoided for years, preferring private connections with his former crew to the public reminiscing such events entailed. But recent days with Tommy had shifted something in his perspective, had reminded him of the importance of preserving stories, of connecting generations, of acknowledging shared history. "I think it's time," Bill said after a moment's consideration. "Been avoiding it too long. Besides, I've got someone I'd like you all to meet." Tommy, he explained, had expressed interest in accompanying him, in meeting the men whose stories he'd heard, in seeing firsthand the brotherhood forged in Thunder Road's steel cocoon. Michael had responded with immediate enthusiasm, promising to coordinate with James and ensure they'd have time together away from the larger events. After ending the call, Bill remained on the porch, contemplating what had prompted his change of heart. Perhaps it was the simple recognition that time was passing, that the opportunities for such gatherings were finite, that the stories needed to be shared before they faded into history's background noise. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a realization that his experiences belonged not just to him, but to a continuum of service and sacrifice that stretched backward and forward through generations of American soldiers. That by connecting Tommy to that legacy, he was fulfilling a responsibility as vital as any military duty he'd performed. The morning advanced, bringing warmth that dried the puddles and lifted mist from the surrounding fields. Bill's thoughts drifted to Frank Murphy, Thunder Road's gunner, lost to cancer 3 years earlier. How he would have enjoyed meeting Tommy, sharing his perspective on their shared experiences, adding his unique voice to the stories Bill had recounted. Frank's absence represented the most painful aspect of legacy, the inevitable losses that accompanied the passage of time, the voices silenced, the perspectives lost. Bill had saved everything Frank had ever written to him: letters, postcards, emails, preserving that voice as best he could against time's erosion. The sound of an approaching vehicle drew Bill from his reflections. A dark sedan turned into his driveway, its government plates immediately identifying it as official transportation. He set down his coffee mug, curious about this unexpected visitor. The car stopped, and a man in his 50s emerged, military bearing evident in his posture despite civilian attire. Bill recognized him immediately. Colonel Kevin Martinez, no longer the young captain he had mentored in Baghdad, but a senior officer approaching the culmination of an impressive career. "Colonel Martinez," Bill called, rising to greet his visitor. "This is an unexpected pleasure." Martinez approached with a warm smile, extending his hand. "Lieutenant Colonel Harrington, still refusing to call me Kevin after all these years?" They embraced briefly, the formality of military protocol giving way to the deeper connection formed in Baghdad's dangerous streets 2 decades earlier. "What brings you to Georgia?" Bill asked as he led Martinez to the porch. "Last I heard, you were deeply engaged in force modernization initiatives at the Pentagon." Martinez nodded, accepting the offered seat. "I was, still am technically, but I'm here on a specific mission that required personal attention." From his briefcase, Martinez withdrew an official envelope bearing Department of the Army letterhead. He handed it to Bill with a mixture of formality and personal satisfaction. "The Army is establishing a new center for urban operations at Fort Benning," Martinez explained as Bill opened the envelope. "A facility dedicated to developing doctrine, tactics, and technologies for the complex environments our forces increasingly face." The letter within was an invitation, not the standard government form letter, but a personal request from the Army Chief of Staff himself. The proposed center would be named the Harrington Center for Urban Warfare Studies, honoring Bill's pioneering work in adapting armored doctrine to urban environments. "They want me to cut a ribbon and make a speech," Bill said, looking up from the letter with a mix of surprise and discomfort. Martinez shook his head. "They want much more than that. They want you to serve as the center's first senior advisor, to help shape its mission, its curriculum, its approach to preparing the next generation of officers for the complexities of urban conflict. The request represented an unexpected return to service, not in uniform, but in a capacity that would allow Bill to directly influence the future of American military operations, to transmit the lessons he'd learned with Thunder Road, with Martinez in Baghdad, with the M1A3 development team, to those who would lead tomorrow's soldiers into whatever conflicts awaited. "I'm retired, Kevin," Bill said, though without conviction. "Have been for years." "Your body retired," Martinez countered. "Your mind, your experience, your wisdom, those remain valuable resources the Army needs, especially now when so many young officers have never experienced large-scale combat operations." Bill studied the letter again, noting the detailed outline of the proposed center's mission. It would address not just tactical considerations, but ethical dimensions of urban warfare, civilian protection protocols, proportional response guidelines, cultural awareness training, precisely the elements he had emphasized throughout his later career. "Why me?" he asked finally. "There are generals with more stars, academics with more publications, younger officers with more recent experience." Martinez's expression grew more serious. "Because you understand what many don't, that urban warfare isn't just about tactics and technology, it's about judgment, about the human dimension, about balancing military necessity with ethical responsibility." He leaned forward, his voice taking on greater intensity. "The Army is investing billions in next-generation combat vehicles, in automated systems, in precision weapons. All necessary, all important. But without the right doctrine, the right leadership philosophy, those investments might lead us astray, might create forces optimized for technical proficiency at the expense of ethical judgment." Bill understood the concern, had expressed similar reservations during his work on the M1A3 program, had advocated consistently for maintaining the primacy of human decision-making in increasingly automated systems. "The center needs your voice," Martinez continued, "needs someone who has commanded tanks in combat but understands their limitations as well as their capabilities. Someone who has seen how technical solutions can fail without proper human implementation. Someone who grasps that urban warfare is ultimately about people, both those who fight and those caught in the crossfire." The proposal represented everything Bill had worked toward throughout his career. The opportunity to institutionalize the lessons he'd learned, to influence military thought beyond the span of his active service, to ensure that future operations balance technical capabilities with ethical considerations. "I'll need time to consider it," he said, carefully refolding the letter, "to discuss it with my family." Martinez nodded, respecting the deliberative approach. "Of course, but there's something else you should know, something that might influence your decision." From his briefcase, he withdrew a second envelope, this one marked with the seal of the Secretary of Defense. The contents proved even more surprising than the first. Notification that William Harrington had been selected to receive the Distinguished Service Medal for his contributions to armor doctrine and urban operations theory throughout his career and beyond active service. "This isn't about a medal," Martinez said, correctly reading Bill's expression. "It's about recognition, acknowledgement that your approach to warfare, your emphasis on balancing technological advancement with ethical implementation, represents the path the Army needs to follow." Bill set the notification aside, uncomfortable with personal recognition, but moved by its significance. Not for himself, but for the philosophy it represented, the validation of principles he had advocated throughout his career, often against institutional resistance. "There's one more thing," Martinez said, his tone softening. "Something personal rather than official." From his wallet, he removed a worn photograph, a young Iraqi man in Republican Guard uniform, standing proudly beside a T-72 tank. The man's features were unmistakably similar to Martinez's own, the same determined eyes, the same strong jawline. "My father," Martinez said simply, taken shortly before Desert Storm. Bill had seen photos of Martinez's father before, but never this particular image, never the proud tank commander in his prime, before surrender, before emigration, before building a new life in America. "He spoke of you often," Martinez continued, his voice thick with emotion. "The American tank commander who treated him with dignity when he surrendered, who ensured he was processed properly as a prisoner rather than left to the chaos of the battlefield, who recognized his humanity despite the opposing flags on your uniforms. Bill remembered the moment clearly. The Iraqi T-72 commander approaching Thunder Road with hands raised, the mixture of fear and dignity in his bearing, the relief in his eyes when met with respectful treatment rather than hostility. He told me it was that experience that shaped his view of America, Martinez said. That made him believe emigration was possible, that a future existed beyond the ruins of his military career, that a society whose soldiers showed such restraint in victory must have values worth embracing. The photograph represented a connection between past and present that transcended national boundaries and military rivalries, a thread of human recognition that had altered the course of multiple lives. When I told you during our time in Baghdad that my father had been a Republican Guard officer, I didn't know you were the specific commander he had encountered, Martinez admitted. It wasn't until later when I described you to him in detail that he made the connection. Bill shook his head in continued amazement at the improbability of their paths intersecting. Not once, but twice, separated by decades and connected by the unlikeliest of circumstances. He wanted to meet you, Martinez continued, to thank you personally for that moment of humanity amid war's inhumanity. Cancer took him before that was possible, but he made me promise to tell you someday how profoundly that single interaction had affected our family's trajectory. The revelation added another dimension to Bill's understanding of legacy, how actions taken without expectation of consequence could ripple outward through time in ways impossible to predict, how a momentary decision to honor an enemy's dignity could eventually result in that enemy's son becoming an American officer, serving the very nation his father had once fought against. Kevin, Bill said finally, I need you to understand something. What happened with your father, treating him properly as a prisoner, ensuring his dignified processing, that wasn't exceptional. It wasn't heroism. It was simply the right thing to do, what any properly trained American soldier should have done in those circumstances. Martinez nodded. I know that's how you see it, but my father encountered other American personnel during his captivity who didn't share your approach, who saw him only as an enemy, not as a fellow soldier doing his duty as he understood it. The contrast made your actions all the more meaningful. They sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of shared history, of connections forged in conflict's crucible and strengthened through subsequent decades. My son Michael turns 13 next month, Martinez said eventually. He's becoming interested in military matters, asks questions about tanks, about desert warfare, about my service and his grandfather's. I've told him the stories, but they remain abstract to him, history rather than living memory. Bill understood immediately where this was leading. You want him to hear it from someone who was there, from the other side of the encounter that changed your family's path. Martinez nodded. If you're willing, if you accept the position at the Urban Warfare Center, perhaps he could visit, could hear directly from you what those days were like, what guided your decisions, how you balanced tactical necessity with ethical responsibility. The request represented yet another thread in the complex tapestry of legacy, another opportunity to transmit not just facts and figures, but values and principles to a new generation. To ensure that the lessons learned at such cost would not fade with the passing of those who had experienced them firsthand. I'd be honored, Bill said simply. Whether or not I accept the position, your son is welcome here anytime, as are you. Martinez smiled, gratitude evident in his expression. Thank you, it means more than you know. As they continued their conversation, shifting to updates on mutual acquaintances and developments in military doctrine, Bill found his thoughts returning to Tommy, to the connections being formed across generations, to the transmission of experience from those who had lived history to those who would shape its future course. Later that day, after Martinez had departed with promises of further communication, Bill placed a call to his son, to Tommy's father. He explained the proposal from the Army, the unexpected recognition, the opportunity to continue contributing to the institution he had served for decades. What do you think, he asked his son, about the position, about the center, about returning to service in this new capacity? The answer came without hesitation. I think it's exactly what you should do, Dad. Tommy talks about nothing but tanks and tactics since spending time with you. You've got wisdom that needs sharing beyond just our family. Bill felt a weight lift at his son's support, a concern he hadn't fully acknowledged even to himself, that pursuing this new role might seem like choosing professional legacy over family connections. Besides, his son added with a chuckle, having the Harrington Center at Fort Benning gives Tommy a perfect excuse to visit you more often. He's already planning to attend the Army's summer leadership program there next year. The news surprised and touched Bill deeply, not because he expected or wanted Tommy to follow his path into military service, but because it represented the boy's growing understanding of purpose beyond self, of service to principles larger than personal ambition. After ending the call, Bill returned to his porch, watching as afternoon sunlight gilded the surrounding landscape. The future stretched before him, not the quiet retirement he had envisioned, but a continued engagement with the institution and values that had defined his life. The Harrington Center would become his final mission, his opportunity to ensure that the lessons of Thunder Road, of Baghdad's streets, of technological development balanced by ethical implementation, would guide those who would command tomorrow's armored forces in whatever conflicts awaited. But beyond the professional legacy, beyond the doctrinal influence, beyond the institutional recognition, lay the more personal transmission of wisdom, from Bill to Tommy, from Martinez to young Michael, from generation to generation in a chain unbroken by time or circumstance. In the quiet of the Georgia afternoon, William Harrington understood finally that this was the true meaning of legacy, not buildings bearing one's name or medals in display cases, but the continuation of values, of wisdom, of hard-earned insights passed to those who would carry them forward into an uncertain future. The compass he had given Tommy, carried by 3 generations of Harrington men through conflicts spanning a century, symbolized this truth. Its needle always pointed true north, just as the principles Bill had lived by, duty, integrity, compassion, even amid conflict's chaos, provided constant guidance regardless of changing circumstances or technological evolution. Steel rusted, tanks became obsolete, tactical doctrines evolved with changing threats. But the fundamental truths about leadership, about ethical decision-making, about balancing mission accomplishment with humanitarian considerations, these endured across generations. That was the legacy that mattered. The legacy of Thunder Road, the legacy of steel.